Hello, good morning, all participants. Our webinar session will begin shortly as we are still waiting for other participants to come in. Hello, good morning, everyone. Thank you so much for inviting us. Thank you so much for joining us. Good morning. I think I'll just begin this webinar as we are still waiting for other participants to come in, but it's okay. They can just join us. Thank you so much for joining us. This is one of the MPC webinar series hosted by the Malaysia Productivity Corporation, a statutory agency under the Ministry of International Trade and Industry. So our today's webinar will focus on the non-tariff measures. While these non-tariff measures, also known NTMs, are pretty new to some, some industry players who are involved in export and import businesses. Our panelists today will enlighten us more on the non-tariff measures, its mechanism, its implementation, especially during this coronavirus economy, as they put it. Okay, so it's such a great pleasure to have our panelists today, Professor Evelyn S. Devadasan from the Faculty of Economics and Administration, the University of Malaya. So before we kickstart this webinar, let me brief some basic house rules for today. This session is a guided presentation delivered by our guest speaker. So all questions can be kept at the end of the presentation. So the participants can drop their questions either at the questions or chat boxes, which can be found on your right, on your GoToWebinar doc. Okay, you can just drop the questions there. Please keep your questions simple yet concise. So before I pass the floor to Prof. Evelyn, let me briefly introduce our guest speaker today. Prof. Evelyn Devadasan is a professor at the Faculty of Economics and Administration, University of Malaya. Her research focuses on international trade and regional integration. She currently serves as an associate editor to the International Journal of Social Economics and a member to the editorial board of the Journal of Contemporary Asia. She has been engaged in collaborative research projects, among others, International Confederation of Free Trade Unions, Asian and Pacific Regional Organization, Asian Development Bank Institute, United Nations Conference on Trade and Development, Food Industry Asia, and more recently, the European Union H2020 Research and Innovation Framework Program on competing regional integration in Southeast Asia. So without further ado, I would like to invite our guest speaker, Prof. Evelyn. Please welcome.
Thank you, Rizal. Good morning, everyone. Before I start, I would like to record my sincere appreciation to the Malaysia Productivity Corporation, or MPC, for giving me this opportunity to share my thoughts on this subject, which is on non-tariff measures. Rizal, do let me know if you can hear me, if it's clear.
I can hear you perfectly well, very clearly.
Yeah, thank you. So what I will look at is NTMs during the pandemic. I mean, we are aware of the number of NTMs that Malaysia has. The latest database indicates that we have close to 920 non-tariff measures. So we want to look at during the pandemic, what were the changes? Were there any increases and so on? Yeah. So let's move on to the next slide, please. Okay, I'll focus on the following key points. To set the context of the study, I will give a broad overview of the trade policy dimension of the pandemic. So when we say trade policy, it is not just about non-tariff measures, it's also about tariffs. Yeah? So we will look at the trade policy as a whole, then we will move into the critical sectors that are often spoken about during this pandemic, which includes medical supplies and food. In these two sectors, what I will do is to look at the incidence of the NTMs during the pandemic and make some observations on specific changes. Sometimes it's not an outright increase in the NTMs, but the way in which those NTMs are implemented or executed, there are some changes. So we'll look at some peculiar observations during this pandemic. And finally, in the light of the title of this talk, which is Managing Non-Tariff Measures, we will look at during the pandemic, what kind of supportive trade policies are needed. So here we'll drill down to some practical assumptions to see how best can NTMs be managed, and more importantly, what are the lessons learned from the changes in the trade policy during the pandemic. And finally, I give some key takeaways from this presentation. Next slide, please. Okay, before we get to the topic, I think it would be good to just do a quick review of what we mean by NTM so that we are all on the same page. There are lots of definitions, classifications out there, but I will draw on the one that is the most comprehensive, UNCTAD 2012. In fact, they have updated this classification in 2018. So let's look at their classification of NTMs. Before that, the definitions. Now, the fact that we call it non-tariff measures, it means anything, any policy measure other than tariffs. That's why it's called non-tariff, but it must have some effects on trade, either in terms of changing the quantities of goods traded, either it increases or decreases the volume of trade, or prices of the goods being traded, or both. So it's not just a trade policy that is a non-tariff element, but it must have some implications on trade. Yeah. So let's look at this classification of UNCTAD. Now, what you'll notice is that you have a great number of NTMs from the import side. They are basically chapters A to O. So there are 15 chapters, yeah, on the import side and just one chapter on the export side. Now, this is quite logical because we tend to regulate goods that come in more than what goes out, yeah. Now, within the imports, you can divide it into technical measures and non-technical. Now, the focus in global trade and even in Malaysia's trade is on technical measures. Why? Simply because Chapter A, sanitary and phytosanitary measures, and Chapter B, technical barriers to trade, dominate global trade. The incidence of NTMs in these two categories is really high. So when people talk about NTMs, very often they go back to referring to SPS, which is sanitary and phytosanitary. You may ask, what is SPS? It could be any measure that affects human health, let's say. So when you trade food, by definition, SPS applies to food products because it affects human health. So under that, you could have many measures, let's say maximum residual limits on peanuts. So that's an example, yeah? Technical barriers to trade would be things like labeling, packaging, for reasons which are not SPS related, yeah? So let's say nutrition labeling, it's just to give information. As long as there are no health claims on it, then you can say that it's a TBT measure. Then we have pre-shipment formalities, and the rest of it follows. You have contingent trade protective measures, non-automatic licensing, price control, finance, measures affecting competition such as like state trading. At one time, Malaysia, Bernas was notified as state trading, yeah, anti-competitive behavior, basically, yeah. Trade-related investment measures, distribution restrictions, subsidies, government procurement, intellectual property, and rules of origin. Finally, we come down to export-related measures. It's just one category. But having said that, I have to let you know that UNCTAD has actually expanded on this because export-related measures are also becoming very important, and you will see that in the case of the pandemic, yeah. So what we mean by NTMs is all these 16 chapters, which comprise from the import side and the export side. But please bear in mind, we cannot use non-tariff measures interchangeably with non-tariff barriers. When you look at these chapters, immediately you can say government procurement is NTB, is a barrier, so is subsidy. So NTBs could be a subset of NTMs, so they cannot be used interchangeably. But NTMs on the whole, they are not barriers because they serve a legitimate non-trade policy objectives such as safety, human health, environmental protection, even cultural reasons when we talk about halal products moving across borders. Next, please. Next. I think you've skipped a slide. Okay, to set the paper in context, we will look at the trade policy as a mentioned dimension. Now, what do we see during the pandemic? We see a sudden rise of export-related measures, which is chapter P, the last chapter. Now, what happens is when you have production stoppages due to lockdowns, whether it's partial or in the case of Malaysia, like a movement control order, there's a constraint on production, and because of that, countries are not able to fulfill local demand. So the immediate reaction is to stop exports or restrict exports. So we see a sudden rise of anti-export policies. And what forms do they take? Export bans, export duties, export licensing or permit requirements, and export quotas. And where do we see it? On medical supplies and food, mainly. Medical supplies, because anyway, COVID-19 is a health crisis before it has come into a full-blown economic crisis affecting all sectors. Yeah, so medical supplies was the first to be targeted. Now, one could argue, are these measures appropriate? Is this the best solution to address trade during a pandemic, or address the circumstance during a pandemic? Now, WTO and even the G20 countries allow for this, provided it meets 4 conditions. One is it should be temporary. Second, it should be targeted. Like in this case, quite a number of it is targeted to medical supplies. Third, it should be transparent. Transparent meaning countries need to notify the WTO on any changes in those measures. Yeah. So WTO, you have an SPS and TBT notification center. So countries need to notify WTO on those changes. And fine, so those are the 3 T's, yeah, targeted, transparent, and temporary. And the last one, it should be proportionate. Of course, you may ask, what do you mean by being proportionate? It should be applied only to the extent it is necessary to deal with the pandemic. So it must be justified in that sense. So it's called being proportionate, yeah. So the latest statistics reveal as of 29 May 2020, what that I could obtain from the International Trade Center is that 95 countries have imposed 124 export restrictions or bans. So we see the sudden rise in export-related measures. Malaysia is also one of them. Malaysia has imposed an export ban on face masks that you would notice, and you can see at the bottom table, highlighted in red, it is restrictive because they are harmful measures. They will distort trade. And that's why the debate goes on whether this should have happened. But please also take note the first 2 lines on in the table on tariff reductions. Now, while we think everything is bleak and we are pessimistic about the rise of these NTMs, please also take note that there have been import liberalization measures through tariff reductions. Next, please. So the upside of this pandemic, yeah, is that countries want to see supplies coming in quickly. So a lot of them are liberalizing imports through unilateral actions through reductions in tariffs. So we'll see Baldwin and Evernet have actually tracked this, and as of 19 April, 77 nations have reduced import barriers on medicines and medical supplies, including Malaysia. Yeah. Now, so what we see now is a rise of export-related measures. That is one form of NTM. Second is it's complemented by import liberalization through tariff reductions. That's not an NTM. And third, we will see simplification of NTMs. Now, NTMs are not like tariffs. Let's take, you have to get a sanitary and phytosanitary certificate for the exports of peanuts, let's say. Now, to get that certificate, you have a lot of conformity assessment procedures, which include inspection, testing, quarantine. So NTMs are not like tariffs. They present themselves as a package. Yeah, that is why it's difficult to negotiate NTMs to bring them down through a trade agreement, because it is just not the NTM per se. The SPS certificate is the NTM, but surrounding that is the compliance procedures or conformity assessments, which include as I mentioned, inspection, transparency, quarantine, testing, many issues, yeah? And to get the NTM certificate, you have got many procedures. You have to go to several agencies. So some of them say it's the procedural obstacles that surround the NTM which are an issue. So what countries have done is they have realized during this pandemic, regulatory delays cannot be condoned. because they need those supplies. Yeah, so many of them took this initiative to simplify, and some even suspended some of these NTMs. So let's take a quick look. Like in the case of Argentina, they simplified the import clearance process of certain critical sanitary supplies. In the case of EU, market surveillance authorities temporarily authorized the marketing of personal protective equipment, PPE products, without the otherwise mandatory CE marking. So that CE marking is an NTM. And what is it? It's a certification mark, yeah, that indicates that you have conformed to health, safety, environmental standards. And that CE mark is important, and it's mandatory if you want to sell within the European Economic Area. So what they did is they went ahead to simplify or sort of relax that measure, and as long as you can prove that your products are meet the health and safety levels, you're allowed to market it. Italy created a process by which suppliers could self-certify their surgical masks as being compliant. India and Nepal announced temporary suspension of rules of origin, the certificate of origin in trade between both countries. And Malaysia is also one of them who joined in this bandwagon. They actually temporarily suspended standard requirements. What happens is there was congestion at the ports. So critical goods were locked in together with non-critical or non-essential goods. So they wanted to clear the non-essential goods to clear the pathway for the critical goods to come in. So they actually had some special exemptions to have quick clearance. Now, some of these measures could have been rolled back, yeah, because anyway, they're all temporary. So they are all there to quickly address the needs of the domestic market, yeah, in individual countries. Next, please. So that's the broad overview of what how NTMs have evolved, yeah, during the pandemic. You see the rise of export-related measures. You see liberalization of tariffs, which complement the rise of NTMs, and at the same time, you see simplification or suspension of NTMs. Now, what is critical is that because it's a health crisis, the first sector that was earmarked to be really affected was medical supplies. Now, very often, even I as a lay person, I'm not an industry player, I'm an academic. When we think of medical products, immediately our mind switches to pharmaceuticals, yeah, medicines and drugs. Medical supplies, it is also one important part of the health business, but it could be that we as lay people take this sector for granted, right? And you also see it is also true in reality in terms of the regulatory framework, because this sector is not very well defined. What do you categorize as medical supplies? And the pandemic has brought to the fore the importance of this subsector of the entire health business. So this sector is defined loosely as a wide range of goods from low-tech soap, gloves, disinfectants, and bandages. I mean, we never thought the importance of hand sanitizers, for example. We took it for granted. We see it in the pharmacies. How many of us actually buy them? But during the pandemic, the demand for hand sanitizers increased, right? Multifold. And then it goes on to very high-tech specialized surgical instruments such as respirators, ventilators, and state-of-the-art X-ray machines. Now, what is the problem with this medical supplies, which I'll tell broadly and also come back to this point later? Because it is not well defined, we cannot prioritize our regulations in this sector. So you have a latest Kazana study done by Idona. She has looked at the 23 product categories which she classifies as the medical supplies list. Now, is this an exhaustive list? Even WCO, World Customs Organization, cannot answer. They have just updated this list, which is available on the web. I've given the reference here or the link. On 9th April, they have earmarked 75 products as COVID-19 medical supplies. Now, this is not exhaustive. They just said it's an indicative list. Now, this will pose a problem during a pandemic because it will link to how much do we want to regulate? How do we classify goods that are risky, not risky, critical, or essential, and non-critical or non-essential, yeah? So that's the first key observation we see. A less well-defined sector leads to lack of regulatory prioritization. Second, when we said just now, there's an increase in export-related measures, Chapter P or NTMs from the export side, we just looked at it and lumped it together and called it export bans, export duties, export licensing requirements. But there's one part that is very interesting is export authorization. Now, export authorization is a less transparent NTM. As I mentioned earlier, it's difficult to identify which NTMs or NTBs. But NTMs give you the room to maneuver, and there's a subtle element of protectionism in that. So what I did is I took an example of China. Now, if you quickly look at the case of China here, China imposed a licensing or permit requirement to export on April 26. And first it started with April 1st. Now, April 1st, China banned exports of test kits, medical supplies by firms not licensed to sell them at home. So it bans the export. So it's an export ban. Yeah? April 26, within that same month, it says that the export prohibition has been downgraded. Now, that gives you an idea like, oh, they're being a bit more relaxed. From a ban, they're downgrading it to just an export restriction, where they call it export authorization, which means you get authorization to export from a ministry or agency or some authority in China. Now, what does this tell you? They're actually moving into less transparent NTMs, because if I'm an authority, the discretion is left to me, right, to give you that authorization. So I could come up with a range of excuses and say that you do not meet that approval. So a lot of countries like to move, because when it's export ban, it raises flag internationally in the international trade community, because it's an outright barrier, it's a restriction. So when you move and you say you're downgrading, you may actually be moving from a case where it's protectionist through a ban to murky protectionism. It's not actually relaxing that NTM. So this again is another point that we need to consider during the pandemic, how countries actually manipulate NTMs. Yeah, next please. So just now I mentioned that because there is no list of critical products, you are unable to prioritize regulations and inspections during emergencies. And so countries were not prepared. Like Malaysia, when they realized there was a congestion in the port, then they quickly identified a few critical products and said that, you know, let's get the non-essentials quickly cleared so we could focus on the critical products. So it came like an afterthought here, because nobody actually was prepared for this pandemic. Now, having said that, when we look at these critical products where it is not well defined, we should also not forget, we should not focus just on finished products, we should focus on raw materials and intermediate inputs, because today, medical supplies could be chemicals, so that come into equipment, certain equipments, like certain masks, surgical masks, you could have some liquid inside there. So it's a lot of chemicals that go about. So it's a lot of raw materials and intermediate inputs, because today trade is not about final goods. It's about parts and components. It's all about supply chains. So NTMs along the supply chains also matter. It's not NTMs on the finished product. So the critical product should also account for raw materials and intermediate goods apart from finished products. The next point is NTMs, as we see from the export side, every country executes a ban or a restriction. So globally, supply is constrained, right? So when globally supply is constrained, there are shortages. So when you look at it as a zero-sum game, it's a very bad solution to move into, because it's affecting global welfare. But what is important is, another thing that dawned on me is, you would have seen in the media the rise of counterfeit critical medical supplies going through online, online media. A lot of people started to purchase masks because there was a shortage through online platforms, and then there were defects in the mask, substandard hand sanitizers, and so on. So this started to make me think, how do we actually regulate products that go online and that are fake actually and are substandard, because there's no inspection, there's no control. And only yesterday while I was surfing the website, I saw Interpol here. I had intercepted thousands of packages of medicines and medical supplies like masks and that went through packages. So they're intercepted because they had monitored fraudulent websites. So there is no right mechanism. So this is one area where policymakers need to be prepared, to actually review the standards and also account for the parallel imports that are coming in, fake imports that are coming in, because during a pandemic, when people are then the demand is extremely high and it cannot be met, that's when you have smugglers bringing in all these counterfeits. So one is to review the standards. Second is to have new, probably NTMs, to protect health and safety, including the interception of counterfeit and substandard products. So the NTMs here probably will be more on the inspection, testing, and so on the compliant procedures or conformity assessments. And finally, new approaches. I mean, the pandemic is just a fantastic example. It's a classic case to tell us we cannot think of NTMs like tariffs, reduce, reduce, reduce. NTMs are going to grow, because in a pandemic, what's going to happen? You see, you're going to look forward to new potential vaccines, new test kits, new drugs, new equipment. Everything is new, and all these new products, equipment and so on, they need new licensing, new certification, new inspecting, new testing. So what are the new approaches to deal with NTMs? So NTMs will increase over time. It's definitely not going to reduce. So from the Malaysian context, we will see there are a lot of pending tariffs. It's not just about NTM. So when I talk about it broadly, I'll also zoom into the Malaysian context so that we can identify as Malaysians what are the problems locally. We also have high tariffs, and of course, it's a very sensitive issue. As Pitya, he showed that the trade-weighted tariffs is considered very high. He had very high, medium, and low. And very high for apron, medium for medical mask, and so on. So countries do protect with tariffs, and we'll come back to that later. How do we have supportive policies in this context? And in the Malaysian context, it's also worth mentioning, I sourced this from the FMM web page. I don't know whether it's still there or the measure is rolled back. Import and excise duties exemption given to manufacturers of hand sanitizers that use raw materials. So exemptions were given, for hand sanitizers that use raw materials. Next, please. So to show, Pitya, he actually came up with measures. He looked at it globally to see what are the share of imports of COVID-19 medical products from countries that import that impose export restrictions. So in the case of Malaysia, what is the vulnerability of Malaysia's imports from those countries that have all these export bans, right? So he has 4 categories: personal protective equipment, PPE, hygiene, case management, and diagnostics. Of course, the most important is PPE, personal protective equipment. And can you see the tallest bar there, which is medical masks, marked in red? 75.5% of Malaysia's imports of medical masks come from countries imposing export restrictions, very high exposure. So the import side matters. Countries are all imposing NTMs from the export side. An import-dependent country like Malaysia will definitely be vulnerable for certain medical supplies like medical masks. And 75.5% is coming from distorted trade. Distorted meaning countries that have export restrictions. Then he talks about high exposure for hand sanitizers. So it's not only the PPE category, 34.6 Venturi mask, 30.6 apron, and heavy duty 25.5%. Now globally, it's worth mentioning here that the market for medical supplies is highly concentrated: China, US, EU. And then you have Malaysia, who's import dependent on some categories and import dependent on and exposed to countries that have this high export restriction. So this is another thing that is worth thinking about when we see how export related NTMs affect our imports. Next, please. Next, I'd like to go to the second sector, which is food. I'm going to give a broad overview of this. Now, I've done a lot of talks on the food sector. The food sector is the most regulated sector in Malaysia. simply because it's about human health. Yeah, so it's loaded with SPS and TBT measures. 51.5% of NTMs in Malaysia are in the food sector. It's highly regulated. We cannot say it's stringent based on the incidence of NTMs. It's just highly regulated. Yeah. Now, with this background in mind, we see now countries restricting food exports. So the NTMs on exports by various countries was just not on medical supplies, it's also on food, yeah? And this has disrupted the food supply chain. Modern productions of the food system are highly complex, yeah? So one disruption in one segment of the supply chain is trickled down all over, yeah? So as at the end of April, more than 20 countries had imposed some form of ban and quota on food exports. And we know Malaysia, this is a very critical problem. We do not have a food crisis yet. We may say, some arguably, people say that we are sitting on the cusp of a food crisis, but we are not there yet. But we know we are highly import dependent. For example, animal feed, yeah, 100% imports. We depend on imports, yeah. So that's a critical point to also think of. And we see countries imposing during this pandemic, like Russia and Kazakhstan, on staple foods like grain, India and Vietnam on rice. I think Vietnam has rolled back on the measure. So this is a threat to food security. Yeah? So you have several threats to food security because countries like Malaysia will be vulnerable to the supply shocks. So you are under threat, not just because of a disruption in the supply chain, but disruptions that follow indirectly from export related NTMs, yeah? So that's the first point for food. Second point for food, you also see a protectionist intent on NTMs. Just like earlier when I talked about in the case of China, right? Instead of an export ban, they moved to an export authorization and justify it on grounds that it is downgrade, yeah? So it's a more relaxed NTM. Now, in the case of Indonesia, I'm taking countries, please do not get me wrong that I'm referring only to these countries. Many countries are culprit of this, but I'm taking countries that are close to us and near and dear to us, yeah, within the region. So Indonesia. Now, Indonesia has a very strict import licensing regime. As we have seen, when there's a pandemic, there may be a shift to new suppliers, to new products, because you look for alternative markets and alternative products when there are blocks to importing, right? So Indonesia, it's very smart. It has an import licensing regime, but it prevents importers from flexibly shifting to other exporting countries. Makes them go through this whole thing about getting a new license, getting new approvals, and so on. So there you could see some kind of protectionist intent, because indirectly they're still trying to curb imports by making it difficult, yeah, for importers. So in the food sector, we see some changes. So I'm not going into the whole gamut of what are the types of NTMs in the food. We have done away with that. We are all aware it's full of SPS and TBTs. But now we see how export-related NTMs are having an impact on imports, and how countries are also tweaking some of their import-related NTMs to embed protectionist elements so they don't receive flack from the international trade community. Next slide, please. So now we seem to think it's all about export restrictions. So there is no database or a new database on the pandemic as yet, because it's still unfolding. The number of measures are still unfolding. There's no end to it at the moment. So what I could look at is the number of notifications made to the WTO. Now, can you see, I was quite surprised to see that 68% of the total number of 144 notifications made to the WTO as of 29 May comprises SPS and TBT measures. So all the while we're talking about just export-related measures, we see a pickup on import-related measures. So we start to think, what could be these import-related measures? Thailand has 7 TBTs, Indonesia 4 SPS and 3 TBTs, Philippines 7 SPS. So next slide, we will see that these SPS and TBTs are because countries are fearful. I mean, when the COVID-19 was said or claimed to be, had to have started from the Wuhan wet market, next slide, please. To have started from the Wuhan wet market, many people imposed import restrictions on food from China. South Korea was one of them. Yeah, they were so worried. All the WTO says the transmission is not from food. The transmission is from human to human contact. I mean, that is the main method of transmission, yeah, according to WTO. But people went ahead, and countries like Indonesia, again, I'm drawing from countries within ASEAN, they imposed an SPS measure where they say that all imports, yeah, should requirement for a certificate of declaration free from COVID-19 for live animals. Countries that were importing live animals were very afraid that these live animals would transmit COVID-19. So we see that SPS measure in the Philippines and also in Indonesia. They started to control, yeah, and impose more SPS measures. So this is something that is worth looking at in the food sector. Again, I mentioned the rise of not just export restrictions, but SPS measures because of the fear of human health. Okay, so they had more human safety, food safety controls, yeah, and the food safety controls were not confined just to food per se. It also moved to non-food. If you were to think of live animals as not really as food that is directly consumed, yeah, it contributes to food products anyway, but not directly consumed, yeah, the transportation of live animals, yeah. Okay, next slide, please. So I'll come to how then do we manage, which is the key of this talk. How do we have policies to support, to be supportive to trade, yeah, during the pandemic? So one is export restrictions. Of course, it's easily said and done. We should discipline export restrictions. I would agree, arguably, although WTO allows it if it's temporary, it is targeted, but we should discipline because it's not the next best solution. You see how shortages globally are causing price increases for medical supplies. So export restrictions should be disciplined because they are harmful. And more importantly, this is not a demand side shock crisis. This is a supply side shock crisis. So when one country has an export restriction to actually control exports, there will be retaliatory effects. That's why you see the huge rise. So those days after World War II, when we talk about tariff wars, right? When one country imposes tariffs, all countries follow suit. We call it the beggar thy neighbor. And today we see this new term coined, sicken their neighbor. You make your neighbors more sick. Sicken their neighbor because there's a global shortage of medical supplies. So it's not a good measure. So what I would say here, we cannot control how countries move. Every country imposes export restrictions. It's not in our hand. It's exogenous. We cannot control it. Yeah. So what is important for us to think about and is that, is there evidence that this will be truly temporary? There is some evidence of the protection being suspended but not eliminated. So there's no end in sight. If you think of the pandemic as not having any end in sight, though the cases tells us that it's, you know, tapering off and so on, but the vaccines are not there yet. There's also no end in sight on these export restrictions. How temporary is temporary? Yeah. Second, a supportive trade policies. So we have seen how imports are now affected and their NTMs from the import side, whether you're relaxing them, whether you're having more SPS measures and TBTs to control food imports, they should be supportive for public health initiatives, because here today now we are thinking of NTMs and SDGs, yeah, which will be my subsequent talk on how you link NTMs to SDGs, and one of it is health, yeah, public health, yeah. So there are calls to remove import duties on health-related products. I'm sure a lot of governments would not be happy, ministries won't be happy when you say remove all import duties on health-related products, yeah. I mean, that should be an immediate action, easy action, I would say, or a quick action, because it's very easy to reduce tariffs. Although it's politically sensitive, easy in economic terms compared to reducing NTMs, because NTMs are there for a legitimate reason, but tariffs are downright protective. So, however, I caution this should be done unilaterally. And that's why we don't focus too much on tariffs. Tariffs are left to G20, and they're moving forward on the commitments to liberalize tariffs in medical supplies globally. Now, they did it for electronic components under the Information Technology Agreement of the WTO. All electronic components pass borders multiple times at zero tariffs because part of a supply chain. If you do not have this, these components, each time they pass through borders, there will be a tariff imposed, and the final product will be extremely costly. So something like that could be thought of in a plurilateral agreement where countries sign or become party to, where they look at unilateral action. So no country is left to do it and the others don't do it, because it has to be a concerted effort globally. Now, coming down, drilling down to the specifics, trade should be regulated with NTMs. I have spoken to a lot of people. All they say is reduce NTMs, suspend NTMs. Now, that is not the case unless you're able to prove that the NTM is unnecessary. It protects domestic industry. It's just a protective element. Fine, then you reduce it or you remove it altogether, which is what MPC has done, a conscious exercise to look at all these NTMs and identify which are necessary, which are unnecessary, and so on. Second, when we talk about regulating NTMs, we should take into account a pandemic is at the time where we'll see an increase in the incidence of NTMs. It's unavoidable. New vaccines will come about. New products will come about, new equipment will come about. So do we say we stop NTMs? No, we should regulate these new products with NTMs. So our mind of looking at NTMs should not be looking at them as a barrier, but looking at them as a means to facilitate trade. So the option, I would say, is not to remove NTMs. The option or the key question one should ask is, how can NTMs be better managed? Next slide, please. How am I with time, Rizal? I think I'm running out of time.
You good. We'll have ample time for question and answers later. You can carry on.
It's okay for me to move on. Yeah, I'm almost there. Just bear with me, please. So let's look at this chart. Yeah, this is a very interesting chart from the Global Trade Alert Database, which already tells you that 38% of the export-related NTMs or export restrictions are harmful. 38%, yeah. So they're very harmful, like how we say sometimes export authorization, people think less harmful than export ban, may not really be. So let's look from the Malaysian perspective. They haven't had it for the pandemic period, so it stops at 2018, but gives you some ideas on this. The share of exports of Malaysia covered by trade distortions. Covered by trade distortions, I'll mention here. GTA Global Trade Alert Database has two measures which they dictate as red measure and amber. So these are harmful measures, and there's a methodology. Sometimes they discriminate against foreign entities vis-a-vis local entities. So there's several ways they calculate them as red and amber measures. So red is more severe than amber, but both are harmful. So what you can see is, can you see the reddish line? Now it has grown. What this reddish line shows you is 10.2% of Malaysian exports to ASEAN. So I'm looking at this chart as Malaysia as an exporter, right? Okay, we have import-related NTMs, we have export-related NTMs. So 10.2% of Malaysia's exports to ASEAN is distorted by ASEAN's import restrictions from the rest of the world. So what I want to point here is we export to ASEAN, okay, but it's restricted by ASEAN's imports, because what I want to show here is we are all part of the supply chain. So ASEAN itself is importing parts and components, or ASEAN itself is also distorting trade through NTM. So 10.2% may not seem high, but means that we are subject, and a lot of the measures are finance measures, which is quite surprising, yeah. And non-automatic, not so surprising, licensing, which was always flagged as a barrier, quotas and tariffs. But what is interesting is 41.4% of Malaysia's exports to the world is distorted by world's import restrictions, particularly subsidies and tariffs. So tariffs are equally, if not more important than NTM. So Malaysia's exports cannot escape from this rise in global restrictions. So we have to be careful in that sense. Yeah. Next slide, please. The next one, we will look at Malaysia from the import side. How much of Malaysia's imports are covered by trade distortions? Now, this is interesting. You may think, why are we bothered about how much our imports are because we are the ones regulating the imports. Now, this is a good thought for policymakers. When we regulate imports, we also have to be very careful. We are importing raw materials. I was in a meeting and the person said, no, we shouldn't remove import NTMs because we need to protect the market and regulate. But what you forget is that we import raw materials and inputs that go into our production processes and then are exported. So if you over-regulate and your regulations are stringent, it's going to affect our domestic producers and our importers. So 21.6% of Malaysia's imports from the world is distorted by its own import-related NTMs. Now, this is a very interesting statistic which tells you, and they're mostly in the form of non-automatic licensing quotas and subsidies. So probably it's good to look at all these various non-automatic licensing requirements. Are they just overly too many? Are they redundant? That affects our own imports and distorts our own imports, especially if you're talking about imports of raw materials. Then 71.9% of Malaysia's imports from Asean is distorted by restrictions in other countries. Because we are importing from ASEAN, that's a huge share, but it is distorted. Now, this just tells you there are restrictions along the supply chain. It means ASEAN is importing from the rest of the world, right? Third countries outside the region, and there are restrictions there. And because it's part of a supply chain, when we import from ASEAN, we are also subject to those restrictions. So this is a good way of looking at NTMs, just like how tariffs, when they are executed along the supply chain, they can be problematic. NTMs can be equal or even more problematic. Yeah. Next slide. So in this case of new NTMs, we want to ensure that the new COVID-19 SPS, the new measures that are coming on board, are truly there for SPS and TBT reasons. They are truly there for safety, health, and they are science-based. You know, SPS measures are all have risk assessments to it, right? Because they're scientific methods to prove whether those tolerance levels are appropriate, are they overly stringent. So we need to monitor this endogenous rise in regulatory changes, just like how we can monitor if it's from the import side. We cannot monitor what other countries do. We can monitor what we do for our businesses. And we need to identify unilateral measures that can be temporarily suspended during emergencies, which we really haven't had an emergency like COVID-19. So to better prepare us for future. Yeah. Second is identify domestic regulatory enforcement processes that have a constraining effect. Remember, NTMs present themselves as a package. MPC has done a lot of work on this, on looking at the enforcement processes. So I won't go in detail. I'm sure a lot of industry players have gone for all those stakeholder engagements and you're aware. So what is pending is we need now to prioritize those regulations, inspection and testing. If we have a clear defined list of critical supplies, essential supplies, and within that list, we should allow low risk critical supplies to undergo less clearance controls, yeah, so they do not get stuck. But having said that, number one, the items must be clearly defined, so there's no room for cheating or manipulation. Second, it should not be at a compromise of relaxing regulations just for the sake of it, meaning there should be no regulatory oversight, because these are products that deal with consumer safety. Yeah, so that should be top priority. The last one, coordination probably between customs and SPS agencies to expedite clearance. Yeah, that will be very technical, how they go about it and what approach. At the regional level, there should be coordination. A lot of people don't like when I say this because Indonesia is a difficult country to move. With all respect to my Indonesian participants, if they are there today, it's not easy. They have a different set of regulations. So people say, why go regional? It's been so hard, but you have no choice. Yeah, I think the pandemic just shows you that coordination, countries cannot go it alone. Unilateral action is harmful to not just your country, but to the rest of the world. So you need to establish a common list of critical medical supplies. And this is contextual. Why I would say that is like when you have at a 6-digit World Customs Organization, when they identify products at a 6-digit harmonized level. Now let's take protective equipment, the gear that the doctors wear. Okay, it's a critical product, it's under medical supply, but someone else may categorize it under apparel because it's a gear, you practically wear that. So you see the classification there becomes important. So it's contextual, it's easier to move ahead with on a regional platform because EU is already moving fast on all these issues. Simplify NTMs, a lot of this has been said, accepting electronic signatures, but you know Indonesia still wants validation. Even when you have electronic signature, they have an additional measure for validation. So all this needs to be sorted out, remove redundant requirements, and this is where MRAs become so important. Mutual recognition agreements, especially for conformity assessment procedures where there's so much of redundant testing, inspection, waste of time, cost for businessmen. So if you can accept your inspection or testing or accreditation to be equivalent to mine, the goods should be allowed to come in and not be tested in the exporting country and then in the importing country, having double. Yeah. Next, please. So why, again, I justify that it should be done at the regional level. Look at the number of notifications made at the WTO. Can you see the arrow yellow that I've pointed? Thailand, Indonesia, and Philippines are almost at the top of the chart. They have made the most number of notifications, Singapore slightly down. So it's not that ASEAN members are not actively getting on board with NTMs. They are executing a lot of SPS and TBTs. So it's only timely that we work with our neighbors, as difficult it may be because of competitive politics vis-a-vis cooperative strategies. We still have to work with them. Finally, I would end my talk. Thank you for bearing with me. Next slide. With 4 key takeaways. Next slide, please. With 4 key takeaways. And these key takeaways, I will elaborate them further in the next webinar, where I talk about going forward. How should future reform take away? So what we learned from today broadly is that a lot of NTMs were spoken about from the export side because people say, oh, countries constrain export, there is shortages, prices of medical supplies going up. So the focus was on export-related NTMs. But people have downplayed that imports matter as much as exports because we're all reliant on imports. So import side NTM regulations matter. We cannot control export-related NTMs. That's the first point, key takeaway. Second, import-related NTMs matter hugely in critical sectors. And we have seen how we are constrained just by the definition of health-related products. People have looked at health just in terms of pharmaceutical. We have to broaden it to medical supplies, which has taken the center stage in this pandemic. Okay, and we also have to broaden it to look at raw materials and intermediate inputs. So a list is needed here, a clear list. Third, we need to navigate, we need to prepare to navigate new risks from new NTMs. The question is not about, yes, monitoring the rise of NTMs, important for unnecessary NTMs, for protectionist NTMs, but we cannot avoid the rise of new NTMs that are health related because people will need new vaccines, new equipment. So what is important is while monitoring NTMs, we need to avoid regulatory delays. So the procedures, the processes need to be checked, and we need to seek alternative risk management strategies. I'm not an expert on this, but I've seen other countries actually embed risk management strategies together with customs. Yeah, so you allay customs of a lot of that monitoring. So you let all audit procedures be taken up through risk management strategies and randomly checks or inspect certain cargoes to ensure quality compliance and so on, yeah, so that the products are not substandard and things like that. And finally, on a broader level, coordination is required. Regional, what we see immediate is a critical list for medical supply, and in a broader context, at a plurilateral side or plurilateral agreement, which involves multinational countries, we need clear rules on NTMs because export restrictions have increased. So that should be taken up. Tariffs also should be taken up at a plurilateral level. And importantly, critical sectors could also be taken up at a plurilateral level through WCO or a new agreement like the Information Technology Agreement. Now we'll see a new one. They have a pharmaceutical agreement that does not incorporate medical supply. So that could be broadened. With that, thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Prof. Evelyn, for enlightening us on the NTMs, especially in critical sectors in light of COVID-19 pandemic. So before I conclude this webinar, I would like to welcome any questions from our attendees. Well, dear participants, you may drop your questions in the question box or chat boxes. So far, I haven't seen any questions here, but you can also alternatively raise your hand. If you are able to see the hand sign on your screen, feel free to click on the hand, then our organizer will be happy to unmute you so you can interact lovely with our guest speaker today. Please, any questions from the floor? All right, we have one hand raised sign here from Rob Stevens. I'm not sure if it's Mr. Rob Stevens. Pardon me. Okay. Please, Mr. Rob Stevens, you are unmuted now.
And
hello.
Can you guys hear me?
Oh yeah, Mr. Rob Stevens, please.
Okay. Yeah, really great presentation, and all the way through it, I had a number of questions. So the first question that I sort of had was, one of the things is that we've seen governments facilitate trade during this crisis, and we're also starting to see governments remove those trade facilitating mechanisms like electronic document acceptance as they come out of the crisis. And I was interested in your views around how do we make those trade facilitation mechanisms stick. And then I had questions around the regional interaction and what role do you see that ASEAN Secretariat will play in that process, and are there any other actors in that process? And then I had a question around there's a difference in the timeline between governments resolving NTBs and businesses needing NTBs resolved.
Sorry,
so businesses might have goods at the border. So the last one was around regional players within ASEAN that can help trade facilitation. So you have ASEAN Secretariat. So what are there any other players? And then the other question I had was around the discrepancy in time to resolve NTBs. So governments work in months and years in some cases. Businesses work in days, and they may have goods stuck at a border or at a port being impacted by an NTB. So just appreciate your views or comments around how to go about aligning those things. Thank you.
Thank you for those questions. They're great questions. I'll try to answer them. I'll start with the one that I'm most familiar with, the role of the ASEAN Secretariat. Yeah? We did some work with Food Industry Asia. Let's say in the case, that was specific to the case of nutrition labeling. We have been trying, ASEAN, I think it has been on the agenda to streamline a lot of these NTMs, especially food standards. Yeah, it has been there on the cards, but it has been pretty slow. So, and one of it was nutrition labeling, which is mandatory in some countries and not in some others. And then there are a lot of variations in it. Some countries go further to make it, to have some health claims on it and so on. So there were a lot of studies done, and then we proposed it. And I believe the working group, the food working group has actually taken up this to see how best they can come up with some common measures and some MRAs to streamline. There are a few MRAs there for pharmaceutical products, cosmetics, and so on. I'm under the impression that it really doesn't work. So I think ASEAN now has a greater role. I feel the pandemic is it's a good lesson that we can learn from the pandemic, is that we really need to consolidate regionally. And I just participated in another webinar, and the ASEAN representative was there, and they mentioned that they are going to take on a lot of this idea of streamlining. Full harmonization like the EU may not be practical in the case of ASEAN, but maybe streamlining some of these measures may be a better way to go. So I understand that ASEAN Secretariat is moving ahead with this. Having said that, I think one more thing that could critically go in, because a lot of it was food-centric, and now the pandemic has shown us that it's not just about food, it's about also medical supplies that needs equal treatment or equal emphasis. So one thing I believe that would be good if this critical list of products can be taken up at the regional level, although WCO is doing a lot of work on it, but because ASEAN has its own, I believe it has its own tariffication database, and when you want to actually list down which are the products that are critical, you also need those codes that come in, and they should be uniform codes, so there won't be any discrepancy at the custom clearance saying that this product doesn't fall under this tariff classification and so on. So I think that list should, a clear defined list could be taken up at the ASEAN Secretariat. So these are two immediate measures or more precise measures that I could see: streamlining NTMs in food that should be taken up aggressively, and also coming up with a critical list at the ASEAN level. Second, you talked about discrepancy. Rizal, did I get the question on NTBs? One of the questions, discrepancy between, goods, is it being caught at the ports? Sorry, if the participant could just
actually on the time frames for resolving NTVs. The time frames for resolving NTVs are different between government and businesses. So Mr. Rob Stephen concerns with the alignment of resolutions of timelines on the NTVs.
Okay, I think one thing that is really difficult, which is real controversial factor, is what are NTBs? The governments will defend their positions of subsidizing. Subsidy is a big NTB, and it's the most politically sensitive. Some people still call it an NTM, but it's an outright NTB. So how do you get governments not to subsidize? So those are outright NTBs which are difficult to touch. Yes, state trading, government procurement. These are all outright NTBs. But let's go to NTMs, because those are difficult to tackle, they're political. Let's go to NTMs. What are the NTMs that could be considered an NTB? It's difficult unless, like the kind of work MPC has done, we may not be able to identify that the NTM is an NTB, because the NTM is needed for legitimate reasons. But the procedures that support the NTM, making businesses run around to 5 agencies to get authorization, multi-level approvals. Some countries, they say lack of transparency in the requirements. And then some, they go on to say that even they have met standards, like in the construction sector, the product has met German standards, which are of high quality, let's say the wash basin, but they're still subject to Malaysian standards. So where are the justifications? So these are all implicit or subtle protectionist elements embedded in the acts and regulations. Now that will take time, because that will take buy-in from the ministries. If it's a NTM measure or a conformity procedure that is gazetted under the act and regulation, then that you cannot escape that timeline, because you have to get in the buy-in, and that regulation needs to be amended. But if it's just a procedure that comes down to a lower level, let's say you have to get the final authorization from the Ministry of Health to get this SPS certificate. But before you reach that level, you have to run around and get do a few additional procedures which are beyond or lower standard operating procedures. Now that can be simplified. And I think MPC is looking into it, and they're doing, because they've come up with some justification on the business compliance costs that is involved in getting or meeting all those procedures. So those procedures. So my answer to your question, I'm so sorry, it may not be direct, because number one, where is the NTB? Where is the barrier? Or instead of calling it an NTB, because that NTM, that final NTM there is valid, is needed. but the obstacle, the procedures are the barriers. So that will take time to be removed and simplified. And industry players make a critical, play a great role here to give their critical input, yeah, to the ministries to see which procedures can be simplified or which obstacles or barriers, without calling them outright NTBs, because they are just supporting procedures or processes for that. So that, I presume, it takes time. MPC has already gone into 2 years, I guess, I believe so, in doing this. So hopefully we see some simplification of the procedures eventually. So, but outright NTBs, it's unless you use trade agreements. I always feel that if you leave it to countries, they will never back down on their subsidies. Even trade agreements have failed and fallen through. So that's why people say, you know, the ASEAN way is sometimes difficult because it goes by consensus. So plurilateral agreements, let's say for the TPP, which Malaysia unfortunately has not ratified. I stand corrected on this. I'm not sure whether they have ratified until now. But earlier when I was looking into it, they have not ratified. You need some kind of external pressure to get rid of outright NTBs. It takes time. I think Bernas, Rizal, I'm not wrong, Bernas is their monopoly over distribution of rice, I think, has been removed, or and it's taken many years before we reach that level. So it's quite difficult to predict on the timeline. The second question. The third one, I've not looked at, to be very honest, I've not looked at trade facilitation because I followed the UNCTAD classification of NTMs. Trade facilitation, we have a trade facilitation agreement, important, which is quite a bit on logistics, which goes a bit wider on logistics, time spent to get customs clearance, days your goods support in shipment and so on. So the whole logistics of it, and logistics are important. We have seen in a pandemic, trade facilitation measures are important. They should be looked at together. Although pre-shipment inspection is there, but and customs clearance is there, but it's from the exporting side. But I do fully agree with you, trade facilitation measures, customs clearance from the importing country is a huge problem. Even with the ASEAN single window and so on, customs is still a huge problem and continues to be a huge one. So probably new approaches to customs clearance, and I'm quite interested to read a bit more on risk management strategies and how they can be embedded. Maybe customs cannot take the full load, but then again, you will receive some, from an academic point of view, I think I can say this, you will receive some flack because there are always revenues involved for the government in lots of procedures. And when you want to move them, it'll affect the stakeholders. So there will be some barriers in removing them, but I think the pandemic shows us that regulatory delays cannot be condoned. Yeah, so eventually you'll get that too. I'm not sure that I've answered all your questions, Mr. Stevens.
Thank you very much, Prof. Evelyn. I think I have one more question, and I guess this is the last question, considering the time limit. We have a question from our fellow academic from University Kebangsaan Malaysia, Professor Andrew Kam. His concern on the immediate measures which can be taken by businesses or government, the authorities on the export and import in light of COVID-19 pandemic, especially on medical and healthcare supplies.
Okay, I mean, although I mentioned that okay, they've identified some products as non-essential. So immediately they could actually consult the industry and identify these essential products and which are critical and which are not critical, because clearance of those products, quick clearance is needed, yeah, to ensure that there is sufficient supply in the market and to curb any sudden increase in price. So I think an immediate measure is to actually come up with our own national level definition with the engagement of the industry, the relevant industry, medical supply, to identify which is critical, which is, and within those that are critical, which is high risk and low risk, and have some what we call as prioritization of the regulation. So in terms of customs clearance, these goods will go through this channel, quick green light clearance, let's say we call it a green light clearance, and clear them quickly. I would see that as a quick and immediate measure for the medical supply sector, because anything else related to NTM procedures, they are time consuming, they will take time. But regulatory prioritization was never there. We had blanket regulations, you follow them strictly to get the goods in and to get the goods out. But today, a pandemic tells you it's an emergency. An emergency situation requires quick, fluid responses. So quick, fluid responses means that some procedures need to be done away with, which Malaysia has done, but probably more is needed. So I see critical list coming in, I see quick clearance coming in, and simplification of some of the procedures or being done away with. I, of course, have read a paper, I wouldn't mention it. They have identified NTMs that are considered SPS and TBT, and NTMs within the medical supply sector by looking at a confined list, which are not SPS and TBT, and said all those should be removed. Only the SPS and TBTs remain. Now, that's quite dangerous, right? Because we know it's just not for health. You need, I'm not saying do away completely with licensing. Maybe in an emergency, you may do away with some products, low-risk products, you may do away with licensing. But high-risk products, you may still need licensing. So although licensing is considered as a chapter in E, which is not SPS or TBT, it's a non-technical, you cannot say that because it's not related directly to human health, we do away with it. That would be dangerous. So I would say come up with a critical list, and then with for products, and then within those products, see what are the NTMs that affect them, and those which can be done away with, or some compliance procedures that could be done away with, which countries have done, yeah, like the CE marking done by EU, and by Malaysia. If you could accept some other countries' testing and inspection as equivalent, or even better, why do we need to retest those products when they come into our shores? We should just do away with it. Thank you, Andrew.
Thank you so much, Prof. Evelyn, for responding to all questions. Thank you very much to our guest speaker for sharing the ideas and insights on managing the NTMs during COVID-19 pandemic. You also raised interesting points and happenings done by Malaysia and our neighboring countries, especially. Thank you very much to our participants for sparing your time and listening to the presentation. I think I can conclude this webinar. We have come to the end of time. I would also like to appreciate Malaysia Productivity Corporation for hosting this webinar. Thank you so much to our guest speaker, Prof. Evelyn Shamala. It's such a great pleasure for having you with us today. So I think that's all for today. And remember, you can also download the material from the doc. There's a tab called Handouts, where you can also download the whole presentation at your convenience. And as this webinar is also recorded, a link for the recording will be sent to all participants via a thank you email. Then you can always watch the recording for your viewing pleasure. With that, I am Rizal bin Muhammad. Thank you so much for listening.
Thank you, Rizal. Thank you, MPC. And thank you all to the participants and also for the questions. It was delightful to share my opinions here, and I look forward to the next webinar. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much. Stay home, stay safe, and stay healthy.
Thank you.